Thanks for giving me an exercise.
I'm Johnny. Good to meet you. You need me to step by?
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll get out of your way, whatever you guys need.
It should mean it's.
Yeah.
Can I see the thing? If they get them, we got it.
You got it.
Question. Yeah. City staff. Who are you? Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
Here.
Intimidating, isn't it?
Oscar, if you want to go that perimeter, I'll look at the interior.
Yep.
I mean, I'm coming around here, so I'm not going to be scared myself. I was alignment.
Jeez, I walked in here and like, oh. That was a bigger crowd than I And then we were just talking about, so you guys will have a presence here, so.
Yep, so two of us will be here.
Okay.
One will be over here, and one in the back.
And do you need, I mean, we can.
Do you need us here?
Do you need us here?
No, you don't need to.
Okay.
You guys can go do it.
Okay. Certainly, if you, I mean, one of the SWAT guys just gave me a call to wonder where like give you. So I mean, yeah, we're on a short leash.
Okay.
You know.
Yeah, I don't anticipate it.
Cool.
How long have you been on ski? I've been on for a little over 3 years.
Oh, really?
There's one more camera person that just got here. Should he put his bag in here?
Yeah. Yeah. If he's cleared to come in, then yeah.
Yep. You just leave it right here. That's all your gear? Yep. Okay. No, I'm almost done. So for 3 years, after 3 years, trying to get a little bit of safety on it. Where you go, trying to get some, that's very much prior to here. So, if I can get back there, my wife will be happy.
We just had a girl, Dean, Carrie. She had to come back to Tampa. She spent time.
Yeah.
Put him on my right, Oscar, so he didn't knock it over.
I think it's a tough road in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Gotta get that light room here.
It's not enforcement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Morning. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. Here with me today are Associate Attorney General Vinita Gupta, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Kristen Clark, and First Assistant United States Attorney Ann Billson. I also want to acknowledge Mayor Jacob Fry, Council President Andrea Jenkins, Community Safety Commissioner Cedric Alexander, and Police Chief Brian O'Hara. Thank you all for joining us today. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was killed at the hands of a law enforcement officer who was sworn to protect him. As Mr. Floyd died, other officers failed to intervene. The Justice Department has since convicted 4 former Minneapolis police officers for their roles in the death of George Floyd. As I told George Floyd's family this morning, his death has had an irrevocable impact on the Minneapolis community, on our country, and on the world. His loss is still felt deeply by those who loved and knew him, and by many who did not. George Floyd should be alive today. Shortly after I was sworn in as Attorney General, I announced that the Justice Department had opened a separate civil investigation into whether the Minneapolis Police Department, the MPD, and the City of Minneapolis engage in a pattern or practice of unconstitutional or unlawful policing. I am here today to announce the findings of that investigation. I am also announcing that the Justice Department, the City of Minneapolis, and the MPD have agreed in principle to negotiate towards a consent decree. Since opening the investigation, the Justice Department has engaged in a comprehensive review of MPD's policies, training, supervision, and use of force investigations. Our review focused on MPD as a whole, not on the actions of any individual officer. We observed many MPD officers who did their difficult work with professionalism, courage, and respect. But the patterns and practices we observed made what happened to George Floyd possible. As one city leader told us, quote, "These systemic issues didn't just occur on May 25th, 2020. There were instances like that that were being reported by the community long before that." The Department of Justice has concluded that there is reasonable cause to believe that the Minneapolis Police Department and the City of Minneapolis engaged in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates the First and Fourth Amendments of the United States Constitution. There is also reasonable cause to believe that they engage in conduct that violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Safe Streets Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Specifically, we found that MPD and the City of Minneapolis engages in a pattern or practice of using excessive force, unlawfully discriminating against Black and Native American people in enforcement activities, violating the rights of people engaged in protected speech, and discriminating against people with behavioral disabilities and responding to them in crisis. I will discuss each finding in somewhat greater detail. First, we found that the Minneapolis Police Department routinely uses excessive force, often when no force is necessary, including unjust, deadly force and unreasonable use of tasers. MPD officers discharge firearms at people without assessing whether the person presents any threat, let alone a threat that would justify deadly force. For example, in 2017, an MPD officer shot and killed an unarmed woman who he said had, quote, spooked him when she approached his squad car. The woman had called 911, to report a possible sexual assault in a nearby alley. We also found that MPD officers routinely disregard the safety of people in their custody. Our review found numerous incidents in which MPD officers responded to a person's statement that they could not breathe with the version of, "You can breathe, you're talking right now." We also found that MPD officers failed to intervene to prevent unreasonable use of force by other officers. Indeed, as outlined in our report, years before he killed George Floyd, Derek Chauvin used excessive force on other occasions in which multiple MPD officers stood by and did not stop him. Second, we found that MPD unlawfully discriminates against Black and Native American people in its enforcement activities, including the use of force following stops. Based on our review of the data, MPD officers stop, search, and then use force against people who are Black and Native American at disproportionate rates. The data showed, for example, that MPD stopped Black and Native American people nearly 6 times more often than white people in situations that did not result in arrest or citation, given their shares of the population. We found several incidents in which MPD officers were not held accountable for racist conduct until there was a public outcry. For example, after MPD officers stopped a car carrying 4 Somali American teens, one officer told the teens, quote, "Do you remember what happened in Black Hawk Down when we killed a bunch of your folk? I'm proud of that. We didn't finish the job over there. If we had, you guys wouldn't be over here right now." As everyone no doubt knows, this is a reference to the 1990s raid by American Special Forces in Mogadishu. Such conduct is deeply disturbing, and it erodes the community's trust in law enforcement. Third, we found that MPD violates the rights of people engaged in protected speech, including by retaliating against protesters as well as members of the press. For example, on May 30th, 2020, MPD officers encountered journalists who were sheltering at a gas station. One officer approached a journalist who was filming while holding up his press credential and shouting, "I'm press." The officer forcefully pushed the journalist's head to the pavement, and when the journalist held up his press credential again, an MPD sergeant pepper sprayed him in the face and walked away. Fourth, we found that MPD, along with the city, discriminates against people with behavioral health disabilities when responding to calls for assistance. Assistant Attorney General Clark will discuss these findings in further detail. To the credit of MPD and city leaders, some important changes have already been instituted. Those include prohibiting all types of neck restraints and banning no-knock search warrants. But as the report outlines, there is more work to be done. The Justice Department is recommending 28 remedial measures that provide a starting framework to improve public safety, build community trust, and comply with the Constitution and federal law. As I noted at the outset, in an important step toward reform, the City of Minneapolis and MPD have signed an agreement in principle with the Department of Justice. This agreement commits the city and MPD to work with the Justice Department, the community, police officers, and other stakeholders to address the problems that we have identified. And this agreement commits all parties to the negotiation to negotiate a legally binding consent decree with an independent monitor. We are grateful to city and MPD leaders for their shared commitment to addressing these deep-seated challenges. I also want to take this opportunity to address the officers of the Minneapolis Police Department. Your profession is essential. The work you do on a daily basis is extremely difficult and often very dangerous. Your responsibilities are enormous and could not be more important. You are asked to keep your community safe, to uphold the rule of law, and to ensure equal justice under law. For you to succeed, your police department must provide you with clear policies and consistent training that explain and reinforce constitutional boundaries and responsibilities. It must give you the support you need to do your jobs safely and effectively. And its supervisors and chain of command must enable you to achieve the highest professional standards. This agreement is an important step forward toward providing you with the support and resources you need to do your job effectively and lawfully. And finally, to the people of Minneapolis, thank you for your partnership throughout our review process. During the investigation, the Justice Department met with many community members, including people who had had encounters with police, religious leaders, advocates, and many others who want a police department that serves them better. We also met with the families of people who died or suffered grave injuries during encounters with MPD officers. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us. We could not have completed this investigation without your contributions. Please continue to engage in these issues in the months ahead. Your involvement is critical to our success. And finally, to the career staff of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, who conducted this investigation. Thank you for your work, which will make Minneapolis a better place for all of its residents. Today, we have completed our investigation, but this is only the first step. We look forward to working with the city and MPD to achieve meaningful and durable reform. I am now pleased to turn this over to Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta.
Thank you, Attorney General Garland. I want to thank the city and MPD for their cooperation with our investigation. And I want to express my sincere gratitude to the many, many community members who shared their experiences with us during the investigation. We opened this investigation following the tragic murder of George Floyd 3 years ago. And what we found is a pattern or practice of unlawful conduct that has compromised MPD's ability to serve and protect the people of Minneapolis. The findings laid out in today's report are troubling. I know this community is still hurting, and in today's announcement may also open up old wounds. There is nothing that I can say today that will undo the wrongs of the past. But I can tell you the Justice Department is committed to working with Minneapolis on a path forward to constitutional policing and stronger police community trust. I want to acknowledge that the city and MPD have made some important changes already. They didn't wait for this report to start the reform process. I am also pleased that the Justice Department and the city have reached an agreement in principle in which we commit to negotiate a court-enforceable, independently monitored consent decree to be filed in federal court. Through this agreement, the city and MPD have shown their commitment to moving expeditiously on reforms aimed at remedying the problems that we've identified, and I commend them for taking this step. The consent decree will provide a pathway to lasting change in Minneapolis. In negotiating and developing the decree, we will seek input from community members, police officers, and city employees. The consent decree will require a transparent reform process, so all of you can see evidence of change and evaluate progress for yourselves. Through decades of experience, we have learned, and I have seen firsthand, that consent decrees can lead to real and lasting change. Most recently, our approach has led to significant improvements in Seattle, Albuquerque, and Baltimore, including notable declines in use of force. But consent decrees are not the only tool to achieve constitutional policing. The department also supports communities and law enforcement agencies through grant programs and technical assistance. For example, we fund public safety and behavioral health partnerships aimed at reducing justice system involvement and diverting individuals with mental health or substance use disorders to treatment. Our grant funds are supporting the Minneapolis Behavioral Health and Wellness Clinic, which serves as a crisis stabilization and drop-off center for law enforcement officers to help divert individuals to care and away from arrest. Before I close, I want to address the city's settlement agreement with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. The Justice Department's investigation is separate and independent from the MDHR investigation. MDHR investigated whether the city and MPD engaged in systemic discriminatory practices in violation of state law. In our investigation, we identified racial discrimination in violations of federal law. In addition, we investigated allegations of discrimination against people with disabilities, the use of excessive force, and the police response to those involved in expressive activities, including members of the media. As I said earlier, we expect that we will negotiate a federal consent decree enforceable in federal court. MDHR's court enforceable agreement with the city has been filed in state court. We commit to working collaboratively with MDHR and the city with the shared goal of creating meaningful and sustainable reform for the people of Minneapolis. To the men and women of MPD, we recognize the challenges you face, the difficulties of your job here and across the country. We know that police officers risk their lives every day in the line of duty, and we know that the city and your command staff owe you the support and clear policies and training. And we know that you need the public's trust to do your jobs effectively and keep your community safe. To the people of Minneapolis, police reform does not happen overnight, and it does not happen without you. It will take time, focused effort, and sustained commitment. In the months ahead, we will need this entire community to help us craft solutions that will result in real and lasting change here in Minneapolis. Together, we can build a Minneapolis that protects the rights, safety, and dignity of all. I will now welcome Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark to discuss the findings of our investigation in greater detail.
Good morning. My name is Kristen Clark. I'm the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. At the heart of many of the protests that unfolded in this city and across the nation was a call for constitutional, fair, and non-discriminatory policing and respect for people's civil rights. Today, we're here to take an important step toward answering that call and committing to the task of building out a core feature of American democracy, an effective, accountable police department that ensures respect for constitutional rights, garners public trust, and keeps people safe. I want to provide further details about the findings of our civil rights investigation that the Attorney General just announced. First, we found that the Minneapolis Police Department uses excessive force, both deadly and less lethal. We reviewed MPD's 19 police shootings and one in-custody death from January 1st of 2016 to August 16th of 2022. Many of these incidents were unconstitutional uses of deadly force. We found that officers used deadly force without probable cause to believe that there was an immediate threat of serious physical harm to the officer or another person. In one example, an off-duty officer fired his gun at a car containing 6 people within 3 seconds of getting out of his squad car. Neck restraints are lethal force, and we found that MPD officers often use neck restraints without warning on people suspected of only minor offenses and on people who posed no threat. We also reviewed less lethal uses of force, tasers, bodily force, and pepper spray. MPD officers' use of tasers often is inconsistent with MPD's own policy and occurs without warning. For example, officers sometimes use multiple successive taser applications without reassessing the need for further activations, which can be dangerous. They also use tasers for minor offenses on kids and on people known to have behavioral health issues. We found that MPD unconstitutionally uses bodily force and pepper spray against people who have committed minor offenses or no offense at all. In addition, we saw repeated instances of excessive force against kids without appropriate attempts to de-escalate the situation. In one instance, an MPD officer wearing street clothes drew his gun and pinned a teenager to the hood of a car for allegedly taking a $5 burrito without paying. In addition, we found instances where MPD officers did not adequately ensure the safety of people in their custody. For example, after pepper spraying a group of people who were fighting, MPD officers ignored pleas to call an ambulance for one woman who needed help because she had asthma. Disregarding the medical distress of a person who is in custody or after a use of force is unlawful. And often officers who could have intervened to stop the use of excessive force by their colleagues did not do so. This violates the Constitution. Our second finding is that the Minneapolis Police Department unlawfully discriminates against Black people in its enforcement activities. This is a first-time finding for us, that the police department also discriminates against Native American people in its enforcement activities. With our statistical experts, we reviewed over 5 years of MPD data from November 1st of 2016 to August 9th of 2022 on roughly 187,000 traffic and pedestrian stops. We also conducted interviews and ride-alongs, and we reviewed other documents and information that the city provided. As part of this systemic discrimination, we found that MPD disproportionately stops Black people and Native American people. During stops involving Black and Native American people, MPD performs searches more frequently than during stops involving white people, even when they behave in similar ways. MPD also uses force during stops involving Black and Native American people more frequently than they do during stops involving white people, even when they behave in similar ways. This, too, is another first. This is the first time that we have made a finding that the police department unlawfully discriminates by using force after stops against Black and Native American people. Starting in late May 2020, when George Floyd was killed, MPD officers suddenly ceased reporting race and gender in many stops despite MPD policy requiring them to collect this data. We estimate that the percentage of daily stops with known race data recorded dropped over 35 percentage points during this period. Still, our analyses of the reported racial data from May 25th of 2020 to August 9th of 2022 showed significant racial disparities in searches and use of force. Working with our statistical experts, we did not find that there was a legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for such different treatment for Black and Native American people during stops or the other enforcement activities that we examined. We also found that the MPD violates people's First Amendment rights by retaliating with force against people engaged in protest and engaged in demonstrations. We saw officers push and pepper spray protesters who posed no threat. Where protesters resisted police commands, officers used force to punish them well after any threat had ended. For example, during a protest in March of 2021, officers beat, kicked, and shoved protesters even after they were restrained. One officer used his full body weight, kneed a passive, restrained protester in the neck as he lay face down, an act that amounted to deadly force. MPD retaliates against journalists and unlawfully restricts their access during protest. Under the First Amendment, the press must be allowed to safely gather and report the news. In addition, we found that the police department retaliates against people who challenge or question them during stops and calls for service. The Constitution protects the right to criticize officers, even with profanity. We also found that MPD officers retaliate against people who observe and record them, even though they have a right to do so. All of this violates the law. Our fourth and final finding is that the MPD and the City of Minneapolis discriminated against people with behavioral health disabilities when responding to calls for assistance. Many calls for service related to behavioral health do not require a law enforcement response. These calls often involve no violence, weapon, or immediate threat. And in these circumstances, a law enforcement-led response can lead to trauma, injury, and even death to people experiencing behavioral health issues. But these harms may be avoided by dispatching behavioral health responders where appropriate. And they can be mitigated by sending behavioral health responders with police where a law enforcement response may be needed. To assess the police department and city's response to behavioral health calls, we analyzed a random sample of behavioral health-related 911 calls to which MPD responded. And we learned that MPD and the city often send the police unnecessarily and that people are harmed as a result. For the vast majority of the calls we reviewed, the person needing behavioral health attention was not reported to have a weapon or to pose an immediate threat. Only 0.45% of over 100,000 mental health calls resulted in an arrest at the scene. This underscores that the current reliance on police-only responses is unwarranted. In December of 2021, the city launched a mobile crisis response pilot program that provides a behavioral health response in addition to or instead of a police response. And that program is a step in the right direction, but that pilot effort lacks the capacity to promptly respond to calls throughout the city. And as a result, MPD continues to be the primary response to behavioral health calls. These findings are serious, and we enter the path to reform with a plan to put in place lasting and enduring changes that will ensure the constitutional, fair, and non-discriminatory policing to which people in this great city are entitled. As I close, I want to extend my gratitude to the mayor and the police chief for joining us today and for their collaboration. I also want to extend deep appreciation for the people across Minneapolis who worked with us at every step of this process. Thanks to the residents, the community leaders, the civil rights advocates, the police officers, and many others who used their voice in this process. An enormous and important task lies ahead, and we want this community to hear us clearly. We stand with you at every stage of the process that lays ahead. I'll now turn the floor over to Ann Bildston, First Assistant U.S. Attorney for the District of Minnesota.
Good morning. Thank you, Assistant Attorney General Clark. My name is Ann Bildston, and I'm the First Assistant U.S. Attorney here at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minneapolis. I am honored to stand here today with our department leadership. Their presence in our city reflects the deep importance of this matter to the department, both now and in the future. And I'm thankful for their strong leadership. While the world watched the tragic events in Minneapolis, those events devastated our community. In Minneapolis, we reached a tipping point a tipping point long in the making and born of a flawed system, but also irrefutable. And now, on this day, we are at a turning point, and there is the hope of change through justice. Following a thorough Department of Justice investigation, we have the resolve, the right people at the table, and the legal foundation to make fair and lawful policing a reality for our entire community. Change will not happen in an instant, it will be a progression. But I believe it can and will happen. We have important factors in our favor. First, we have an engaged community. During our investigation, we heard from over 2,000 community members and local organizations. Their input was critical. It will continue to be so as we travel the path of change. Second, the city of Minneapolis' leaders support reform and will work with us to achieve it. Third, the civil rights laws will enforce change. Specifically, following a period of negotiation with the city and continued community input, a court-enforceable consent decree will underpin this process. I would like to extend this office's thanks to our community. We care deeply about your experiences, concerns, and ideas for change. As this process unfolds, you will continue to have the opportunity for input throughout it. You are key to the success of this endeavor. Thank you to the Department of Justice team that devoted themselves to this investigation, including those from the Civil Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Minnesota. Their hard work and commitment is evident in the findings report. We will remain closely involved in this matter as we pursue remedies based on our findings. This office relies on the work of law enforcement, and we value those relationships. But we will act where unconstitutional and illegal policing occurs. Doing so helps ensure that our communities are truly safe and that our police forces are sound and respected. Thank you to the city for its cooperation with our investigation and commitment to change as we move forward. We appreciate our relationships with city leaders and look forward to joining them to bring change to policing in Minneapolis. I would now like to welcome to the podium Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey.
I remember watching the video of George Floyd's murder for the very first time, then heading into my office late at night and pacing with one thought in my mind, which is that now things have to be different. Now things have to change. And at every level of government and across our city, we understand that change is non-negotiable. Progress can be painful and the obstacles can be great. But we haven't let up in the 3 years since the murder of George Floyd. And today it marks a new chapter in the history of public safety in Minneapolis. And I'll tell you, we do see action in motion today. To take real action, we first have to acknowledge where we've been, the pain we've caused, and to take a hard look at the specifics that need to be changed. And the facts that show the story of our past. I want to give a huge thank you to United States Attorney General Merrick Garland, the whole team at the Department of Justice, and our team here locally at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Thank you for your collaborative approach. Thank you also for a report that is thoughtful, is deliberate, is objective, and is thorough. We are going to use these findings to better policing in the city of Minneapolis. Thank you to our attorneys locally at the city of Minneapolis who have been at the table hard negotiating. Kristen Anderson, Sarah Lathrop, and Yvette McGee-Brown have worked tirelessly. I also want to thank our Commissioner of Community Safety, Cedric Alexander, and our Chief of Police, Brian O'Hara. I know that through your leadership, we will see the change in our community, in our city that so many people are demanding. And that change, it has been now more than 3 years in the making. Now, we haven't been just waiting and sitting on our hands to see through change. We've wholeheartedly shifted our form of government. We've added an Office of Community Safety to provide an integrated approach. We've made sure that in addition to policing, we can also have alternative approaches that don't require a police officer with a gun, and we want to double down on that work even further. We hired a new commissioner, a new police chief, a new city attorney. We're doubling down on violence prevention work even further, and we want to extend and enhance safety beyond policing. And still, the question that I often get from neighbors in our city is, what does success look like? What does the path forward look like? What does it ultimately look like when we have fair and just policing in Minneapolis? Our success won't be relegated to a report. It won't be relegated to compliance figures or a judge's signature. Our success will be defined by the people of Minneapolis feeling safe, in fact, feeling safer when interacting with police in our city. We are not going to stop until every single person in every single neighborhood and zip code feels safe interacting with the police. That's regardless of their background, regardless of the neighborhood that they call home. We need them to feel safer in interacting with a police officer, knowing that that officer is guided by commitment to justice. The data and the facts the DOJ has presented in these findings are aligned with what communities of color have been telling us now for many years, in fact, generations. Since May of 2020, we've been facing this reality on a daily basis. And while I do believe that we've made progress, the truth is that we still have a whole lot of work to do. We're leaning into that work. And the truth is that we needed this help. We needed this partnership with the Department of Justice to further embed the policy shifts that we've made. And as I've said before, change, it doesn't just happen on paper. We can pass all the policy we want, but until every single supervisor, every single rank and file officer understands the policy that's in place, is trained in on that policy, and is held accountable when the expectations and the values that we expect are not met, until those things happen, we aren't there yet. The success I talked about earlier, that will be fulfilled when we see a true culture shift within the Minneapolis Police Department. I'm committed to this work. Our police department, our chief, is committed to this work. Our city enterprise is committed to this work. From our commissioner to our chief to rank and file, we are ready to give Minneapolis residents reason to believe that change is in fact happening. Change they can see and change that they can feel, not on a piece of paper, but in every single interaction that they have. To the officers who have stuck around, thank you. I know you're committed to this work. I believe you are ready for change too. You're here for the right reasons, to protect and serve our community with respect and dignity. This work happens in partnership. I'm optimistic that over the next several years, and yes, this will take several years, that Minneapolis will be the city that the nation looks to for constitutional and trustworthy policing. And I'm looking forward to partnering with the DOJ in this process. This work is foundational to the very health of our city. We have the power here to effect lasting change, to effect generational change, and we embrace that.
My name is Brian O'Hara, and I am the Minneapolis Chief of Police. Attorney General Garland, we are incredibly thankful for the deep dive assessment that the United States Department of Justice has done on behalf of the people of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department. We acknowledge the pain, anger, frustration, fear, and sense of vulnerability that many people in our community have endured. I am here today on behalf of the MPD to affirm our commitment to moving forward together. It is our time to lead, to heal, rebuild, and create the kind of police department that every Minneapolis resident deserves. Know that the good people of the MPD are deeply committed to making it the best police department in the nation. But we will only be able to do that with the support of our entire community. When I became the police chief, I pledged to work hand in hand with all of our partners to rebuild bridges of trust and safety in Minneapolis. That work started the day I became chief, and it will continue in earnest until the MPD fully reflects the constitutional, fair, and just system of policing services the people of Minneapolis deserve. I have been through this before. I know what good constitutional policing looks like, and I trust that the experience I have gained from my years in Newark, leading police and earning the trust of many in community through the implementation of reforms under a federal consent decree there, will help ensure that the MPD will be successful at making change real here. Our goal is to move forward together and ensure that we provide the best possible policing services for all members of our community. I promise you today that our department will be transparent and will provide an ongoing accounting of our successes as well as our challenges, while at the same time continuing our dedicated efforts to keep all people of Minneapolis safe and secure today and tomorrow. It's a tall order, but one that I strongly believe we can achieve together. We will change the narrative around policing in this city. Out of the darkness and trauma our residents and our police officers have experienced over the last 3 years, we will emerge as a beacon of light for the rest of the world. I have great faith in the resilience of the MPD and in the character of our community. As we move through this process together, we will continue to heal and we will rebuild stronger. At the end of this process, our city will be safer, and the police and all communities of this city will be more united than ever before.
Thank you, Chief. At this time, we will take some questions from the media. I ask that you please stay on topic. If I call on you for a question, please state to whom your question is posed so we can have the right person at the podium. Stephen Montemayor from the Star Tribune, please.
Yes, provide more detail on what the immediate next steps from this process.
And to whom is your question posed?
To yourself or Attorney General Garland.
Attorney General.
The immediate next steps are consultations with stakeholders, of which there are many in the community. And I'm going to, because you're looking for more detail than just that general answer, I'm going to ask Kristen Clark to fill in.
The community will be deeply engaged every step of the way. The city has entered into an agreement in principle and agreed to enter into a consent decree that will include an independent monitor. That consent decree will be entered in a federal court before a federal judge. We will take in input from the community, from stakeholders, and from law enforcement in putting together the terms of that consent decree. That will include the reforms that we deem necessary to resolve the 4 core findings that are set forth in the Justice Department's findings report.
Next question, Pierre Thomas from ABC.
General Garland, if you would. You had similar findings in the city of Louisville. Now stuck in Metro City. How concerned are you that this is a situation and a practice you see across the nation? And speak, if you would, to the importance of addressing it in the sense that Black people, brown people, this is deals with how they live their daily lives. How do you address it?
Okay. Every person in the United States must be able to go about their daily lives without concern that they will be affected by unconstitutional policing, and particularly unconstitutional force. That's what a democracy is about. People can participate in civic life free of interference from the state as long as they are behaving lawfully. We saw here in Minneapolis, and what we saw in the report is heartbreaking, and I think everybody in Minneapolis realizes that. A core function of the Justice Department and a core priority during my tenure as Attorney General is enforcement of the civil rights laws and of the Constitution. That's why we did this investigation. This was, I think, one of the first things I announced when I became Attorney General. It's why we did it in Louisville, why we did it in Phoenix, why we're doing it in other places. It's why we bring criminal cases where officers commit unconstitutional violations of the law. And it's why, as Associate Attorney General Gupta pointed out, we provide training and funds so that police departments can learn and ensure constitutional policing. This is the job of the Justice Department to do this, and we will continue with unrelentingly and with vigor. Thank you.
And Chief, how do you get your officers to look at people of color as citizens first and not suspects first?
Well, I think the reality is the issues here that we are trying to address are problems not just in policing, but in the justice system as a whole and in larger society as a whole in the United States. And that's a very complicated, complex problem to address. But I look at this not as a list of reforms that have to be done that we're just going to check off one after the other and try and be done with this. This is truly about trying to change culture around policing and trying to really build bridges and trying to ensure that, while we are faced with very real challenges addressing street crime and violence, trying to keep people alive, that as we do so, we have a culture that our officers, intentionally try to earn people's trust in every interaction that they do. So this isn't something that started overnight. This has been building up for decades historically, but it's something I believe very confidently through this process, we will be in a situation increasingly where more people will have faith in our police department.
Tricia Ahmed from the Associated Press. We'll move to Lou Ragoose from KARE 11.
Or any of the DOJ officials, I'm wondering if you could give us as specific as you can on a timeline on how long generally the negotiation takes before the consent decree is signed. Once it is signed, how long does it stay in place, and how do you know when it can be lifted?
I can start with a response to that question. We can't give you an exact amount of time that it will take to negotiate the consent decree. It could take a number of months. And even up to a year or more, depending on how the negotiations go. We want to do it as efficiently as possible, obviously. In terms of how long it will last, that will be part of the negotiation.
And just as a follow-up, who will be the independent monitor, and could any of this get altered if there's an administration change?
The choice of the independent monitor will be under consideration, and we expect that will be done relatively quickly. Next question, we have Ernesto Londoño from the New York Times.
Thanks so much. This is a question for the mayor and the police chief. Can you address the staffing level and the extent to which you think that poses a challenge as you embark on this era of transformation? And secondly, I'm wondering if you think it's sound policy to have two separate monitors overseeing the state and the federal consent decrees. And could you conceivably combine those two since there's an overlapping set of recommendations?
Thank you to the questions. To the second, is it sound policy to have two different independent monitors that may or may not agree whether compliance has been met or not? No, it is not. Very early on in this process, the council president and I made clear that one of the pieces where coordination was essential was with an independent monitor. We don't want two distinct agreements with two distinct monitors with two different determinations of whether compliance has been met or not, that's not a way to get to clear and objective success. And so what we as a city are committed to is working with both the DOJ as well as the state to getting to an individual that can be the monitor, and making sure that none of the provisions within the respective agreements conflict. That's essential. Part of the area where I feel that collectively we have not done enough as a city and enough in MPD is making sure that in addition to policies being passed, that policies are fully understood, that the different circumstances that can arise, officers know what to do, how to do it, and then ultimately they're held accountable when they don't. And to your second question was regard to the numbers that we have. Obviously, we've seen a whole lot of attrition over the last several years. We need police officers to handle some of the most difficult circumstances that exist in our city, and we need constitutional policing. Both of these things are true at the same time. And the work of recruiting right now is ongoing, but the message to would-be recruits is this is an opportunity to be part of the change. This is an opportunity to set a tone and make a difference for the residents of our city and be an example for others to follow. So if you want to be on the cutting edge, if you want to come in at the ground level of doing a ton of work with a whole lot of experts and people who are committed to just constitutional policing, Minneapolis is the place to come. But we are insisting on those values.
Just to add to what the mayor said, obviously the MPD has lost hundreds of officers over the last 3 years. And just like all of the residents of the city of Minneapolis, the officers who remain have experienced a whole lot of trauma. And the reality is this is an incredibly difficult job to be a police officer in this city at this time. But they have made incredible progress, fighting back some of the highest levels of violence that the city has seen in a generation. And I have seen already just anecdotal information from people coming through the process, from an increase in application, that yes, there is a word starting to get out, both in community, in the applicants that we see, that people are beginning to be excited about what is happening in Minneapolis. And I know there's a very, very strong desire from everyone in Minneapolis, as well as in the police department, to have progress. So as the mayor said, we're just trying to tap down on that and get the word out all across the country, but especially to our residents. If you want to be a part of making this better, if you want to be an example for the world how we can get it right, this is the place to come, but it is not an easy job to try and do that.
Just very briefly, I want to observe that the United States findings include real and unique concerns under the First Amendment and the Americans with Disabilities Act. These issues sweep beyond the scope of the MDHR report and are issues of federal and constitutional concern that we'll endeavor to resolve through our consent decree.
Thank you. This concludes our remarks today. I do want to note that the Justice Department will hold a virtual presentation on the findings tonight at 5 p.m. Members of the public are encouraged to attend and learn more about the findings. We will post the link to this on our social media and website. Thank you all for coming today.
I'm sorry, what happens if there is an administrative?
What about the press this year? The independent press.
Yes.
Independent press. What about the independent press? Any independent press can say anything. This is tomfoolery.
Hello?
This is just what happens. We come and people from all over make a statement and we get to say nothing and we're right here dealing with the trauma. Fly through on all levels. Independent press gets to say nothing as usual.
See if someone. I'll try my best to. Thank you.
Didn't know that you were supposed to actually
others as well, was that that prosecution and conviction would get relegated to the sideline. Okay, we convicted Chauvin. That's it. It's over. No, we're dealing with problems that need to be worked on over time. That's why I wrote a book about this thing, because I really want to drive a conversation that can lead us to a better place for citizens, for police, for everyone. And I think that if this is, yes, we're in the beginning, but we have a real chance at a meaningful reform, and I think we should take it.
Yeah, we did talk about your book, Breaking the Wheel, sort of, and working toward really meaningful police reform. To your point, to have Minneapolis and Minnesota under scrutiny from these two different state and federal entities, that's not a very common, is my understanding, occurrence. Do you think that this impacts what might be in the future for other cities?
Well, let me tell you, there's really no city in America that doesn't have this problem. Rural areas have it. I was speaking with a friend of mine who was in law enforcement in the state of Idaho, and he was telling me how they had issues there they had to work out. So I don't think Minnesota and Minneapolis should feel like we're some isolated bad example. No, this is a national problem. It's a historic problem. It's a problem that we've had in our country ever since ever since the Civil War. Ever since slavery ended, we've been in this bad cycle. And then at the same time, we have such amazing cops who get out there every day, sacrifice everything for the safety of the rest of us, and they do a wonderful job. This represents a chance to do some things on officer wellness. It gives us a chance to do some things that really, really will be beneficial to people who do law enforcement and make their jobs more attractive and more palatable and more enjoyable as well. I mean, morale is low. Now we can start the process of rebuilding that morale, but we have to do it with people's civil rights and human rights in mind, and I think we can do that.
Was there anything that you heard over that hour-long news conference, or anything that you might have read in this 90-page report from the DOJ that really stood out to you, that you found was particularly helpful or new, or just needs to be talked about further?
Well, what really struck me overall is that, we've been in this sort of process of denial. I mean, what really struck me is that we often conflate public safety and policing, and we act like we can only have safety if we tolerate police misconduct. What really came through for me is that, no, we can have both. We can have excellent relationships between police and community, and we can have a safe community. In fact, both probably depend upon the other. So that's what really struck to me, because so often I've been in conversations where people will say, well, look, it's fine that, you're raising concerns about police-community relations, but won't this cause safety to suffer? The answer is absolutely not. Greater trust between police and community will lead to safer communities. And so that the overall impact is what hit me pretty hard. I will tell you that I was very glad that there was a lot of focus on the problems of people with mental health issues and behavioral health issues. When myself and Commissioner John Harrington, who was the head of the Minnesota Public Safety Commission, when we led a working group to reduce deadly force encounters, which concluded 4 months before George Floyd's death, we found that as many as 30% to maybe half of the people who lost their lives or were injured in deadly force encounters with police were in the midst of a mental health crisis. So I think that particular finding, we can do something meaningful about. We can do something meaningful about it now.
It was very striking. It was a striking part of the news conference and the report in talking about how the city came up with a pilot program to try to, bring less force to calls dealing with people who are having behavioral health disabilities or crises. But then I think with some of the other reform efforts that we've heard about in the past few years from MPD, it was like they weren't sure quite how it was going, or, it's just a pilot program, so it's not able to service, a great part of the city. Sometimes it's felt like we've heard about reforms, but they're just not able to be driven to the finish line or monitored to ensure that they're actually happening. Is that part of the way that a consent decree can be helpful?
Yes, absolutely, because what generally happens, and the reason I entitled my book Break the Wheel because there is this cyclical phenomenon where there's a tragic incident, everybody stops and says, yes, that's very bad. Then we have an investigative committee. Then we come up with some recommendations. Then the energy dies, focus changes, and we don't do much. Look at Rodney King, look at, so many cases over the years. But with this consent decree, it's like, no, this is here. There's no waiting it out. We're going to have to make some changes around here. And I think that is a good thing. And I am certain that it will improve public safety and civil and human rights, and it will improve officer morale. I want to encourage Minnesotans to have their encourage their kids to join the police department. It'll be a department where they can protect people and help people, but they can also protect people's civil and human rights and be a true benefit and an appreciated asset in our community. Unfortunately, Derek Chauvin's behavior hurt the trust. Now it's time to start restoring it.
I visited Newark, New Jersey back in October when Brian O'Hara was being considered to become the new Minneapolis police chief. It's a lot of the reason that Mayor Frey said that he selected O'Hara to come on. One of the things in Newark is that people may not know this if you're not familiar with the process. It takes years, so they have to negotiate for months now on what the different terms would be. And then they're under that agreement, really, I guess, indefinitely, almost until a judge or the powers that be who are overseeing it decide that they've, in fact, met those goals, met those reforms. Would you be comfortable talking a little bit about the role of independent monitor? How do we make sure that we're getting the right people lined up to keep an eye on this process, the different stakeholders, all of them, from, law enforcement to community members? We want to hear from everybody.
Well, I'd say you need a few things in a monitor. One, you've got to have somebody who has a shot at gaining the trust of both sides. We need the cooperation and trust of the police department. We also need the cooperation and trust of neighborhoods. So you need somebody who is credible on both sides, and that is important. And those folks, there's not tons of them, right? Sometimes they're hard to come by, but that is something that we should strive to obtain. The other thing that we're really going to need is somebody with some experience who understands there will be good days, there will be bad days. Tragic incidents are going to happen. That's not going to say things aren't working. That doesn't mean we should quit. But you've got to have somebody who's been around the block enough to know that this is going to take time. And then you got to have somebody who has the courage to tell either side that, hey, I'm not seeing your point here. Because if you're a person who shrinks under a little public criticism, might not be the job for you, because policing invokes strong emotions, no doubt about it, from people in law enforcement and from community. So you've got to have somebody with a certain stoutness of spirit who will stick and stay and won't back off the table. So that's a tall order, but they're out there. I've met many who I think would be good. And let me tell you, Newark was under a federal consent decree, had serious problems, real problems. Mm-hmm. And yet, they improved things. So did the city of Camden, New Jersey. Well, Minnesota can be a model. Minneapolis can be a model for how we really did turn things around. A few years from now, we can say, things that we were tough for a while, but we all work together and things are much better. And I just think we have to have faith in that moment.
All right. Attorney General Keith Ellison, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts. I want to bring back in Angie Porter now, law professor based in Washington, former litigator here in Minneapolis. Angie, I know that you have read this investigation, this report, some of it. It's quite a long report, but you were able to page through it. And I know there are these 28 remedial measures or different measures that the Department of Justice is essentially suggesting that Minneapolis police put into practice. And we do understand that there's a press conference from Communities United Against Police Brutality that's going on. If we can bring that to you, we will. I only mention that because we want to make sure that we're hearing throughout today from all the different stakeholders in the community, from police to different community groups to different lawmakers. We're working to bring those reactions in, and we'll throughout this afternoon, both here on All Things Considered starting at 3 and at nprnews.org. So we've got people out there in the community. Just want to update everybody on that. But Angie, as you're reading through some of these findings, Is there anything that stands out to you? Attorney General Ellison mentioned talking about discriminating against people with behavioral health disabilities, response to calls. What's your sense for how that needs to change moving forward?
Well, looking through, these recommendations are keyed to the findings. And generally, I actually made a note as I was reading them. They generally say do better all around. And the report is looking at doing better for each of the things that are being done wrong, including the retaliatory behavior of MPD officers during the protests after George Floyd was murdered, during stops and calls, the behavior towards journalists, the lack of discipline in the department, as you both laid out, the conduct and discriminatory behavior against people with behavioral health disabilities. Coming in and honing on the race-based discrimination recommendations, what was notable for me was recommendation number 8, which is reduce unjustified disparities. It is a comically short recommendation, essentially just saying where there's racial disparities, take steps to reduce or eliminate them within MPD. And my guess is that is short and vague because that is the thing that is going to be the crux of these negotiations. And that is the hardest task set before both the city and the DOJ. And it is one that we're going to have to really hold people to. And it starts with a knowledge of history, going back to the inception of the colonies that now form the US. Eliminate racist disparities. How? We're going to have to do that by talking about racism and doing things that are based on race, which is something that really runs counter to the US rhetoric right now, both in popular culture and in the judiciary. So for a consent decree, which will be enforced by the judiciary, fortunately, that is a contractual thing that will need to be held to the agreement of the parties. And so it gives us a little more leeway than some other measures that might be passed by the legislature. But I think it's going to have to start with squaring with our history, which is connected to some debates around history and how it's taught. It's really going to take the knowledge and the learning from all communities about how there are two systems of government in this country, two systems of law, special laws pertaining to the movements and activities of Black people, of Native American people, going back to the establishment of slave patrollers during enslavement. Once we square with the truth of that, we can more effectively address a recommendation like recommendation number 8. So that's the big takeaway for me. And I hope that when they are talking with stakeholders, they're really talking with folks who know that history and folks who want to see it as part of the measures, whether that comes in the form of reparations, whether that comes in the form of education. But it's going to have to be pretty broad to change an entire culture that's baked into the institution of policing.
You know, when I visited Newark, we talked about Police Chief Brian O'Hara is from there, and they were under a consent decree. Even as the reforms were ongoing, a lot of people out there told me that there wasn't really buy-in from the rank and file, and that, you know, you can put new leadership into place, you can put these reforms into place, but if there isn't buy-in from the rank and file, that culture cannot change. You know, you heard Chief Brian O'Hara talking about both a staffing crisis right now with the Minneapolis Police Department. They've lost hundreds of officers in the past few years. The trauma that he says that everybody is undergoing who is still on the job. And I want to note we've reached out to the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association. They have declined an interview. We'd love to hear from the perspective of, the Minneapolis Police Union, these officers that are here. But without that buy-in, that seems like the elephant in the room, without talking about systemic racism, acknowledging it, acknowledging how to move forward. How do you begin that process? What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel like this report addressed the rank and file officers?
Now, this is actually something I see as ironically a good thing, Nina. As we all know, there were departures of hundreds of officers after George Floyd was murdered. And as you heard Brian O'Hara talk, he acknowledged that we have the last officer standing still left with us. Mayor Fry said that as well. So the folks who are still in that department, chances are they're on board with this. Brian O'Hara is coming from Newark, where he experienced retirements and departures, I'm sure, because he was really pushing beyond the requirements of that consent decree. And so I'm sure there will be a little more attrition, but the unique thing about Minneapolis in this moment is that there has been an exodus of officers who did not believe in the things that need to be changed in that department. And so we're looking at sort of a core cadre of folks who are willing to stay on. And I think that says something about their willingness to change the culture or put in place a culture that they sort of already are on board with. If they've made it to now, then I think they might stay.
Yeah,
So that's one thing that I think is sort of a silver lining here.
Sure. And Chief O'Hara has said that to me and to many people for months. He said, the officers that are still here, from his perspective at least, and what he's portraying, are really want to make some systemic changes for the good of everybody, including their own safety. Some of the most concerning parts of this report had to do with supervisors and sort of the role of those supervisory or, mid-level people that kind of field complaints and then not looking into complaints from people who encountered police officers. It just seems like the processes of reporting, like reporting race after the killing of George Floyd, they said that it appeared that officers stopped doing that. I think they said it fell by like 30%. So I don't know where the buy-in is or if it's in fact there from all the officers that remain. But how do you foresee a consent decree helping to make sure that those types of reforms are actually happening? That seems like the biggest part of it is this process of auditing.
Yeah, I mean, this investigation, and you have some of the best investigators in the country on this, uncovered the cover-up. So that was a takeaway for me too, Nina, was that after George Floyd is murdered and after all of the increased attention on the city of Minneapolis, suddenly you have a drop-off, a sharp decline in documenting the identities of people who are stopped and arrested, the racial identities, and they also said gender as well. And that is cover-up at work, and that is culture at work. That is concerted action. And it is now put on full display. So the recommendations are definitely consonant with that finding. They have recommended that documentation be back in place to its full percentage, and that moving forward, there's even more data collected about stops, arrests, and any other police interactions that we're seeing. So I think that is the role of a consent decree right there, is really putting those things, those tendencies in the light so that they can be checked in the future.
Thank you for that, Angie. We want to go now to this news conference with community members for Communities Against Police Brutality. I believe Nakima Levy-Armstrong is at the podium.
Dalal Eid, Tekle Sundberg, Amir Locke, of course, George Floyd, and we also can't forget about Winston Smith, who, although was not killed by Minneapolis Police Department, he was killed by the U.S. Marshals in the city of Minneapolis as we were mourning the police murder of George Floyd. And most recently, we had a police killing at the hands of the FBI in the city of Minneapolis. So we do not feel safe. We are grateful that the Department of Justice has finally decided to intervene. This intervention was long overdue, and we are hopeful, we are doing our best to put our trust in them, that they will hold Minneapolis elected officials accountable, because they have not been accountable to the people. Not just this current administration, but going back many, many administrations in which they knew about the atrocious behavior of the Minneapolis Police Department. They quietly settled excessive force lawsuits to the tune of tens of millions of dollars and they failed to correct the injustices and the abuses and the policy violations that have been going on for years. So to see elected officials and those who have been appointed on television today saying that now they're going to do what they need to do is a slap in the face, particularly to those who have been oppressed, those who have been abused, those who have been crying out for justice, and those who have not been heard in the wake of the violence that has happened. We do not have trust in these systems or in these individuals because they have failed us time and time and time and time again. That story needs to be told. Even as we have documented evidence of what has happened to Black people, we don't see an apology to Black people in the city of Minneapolis. We don't see reparations to those families who have lost victims, who have lost their loved ones to police violence, where the officers were never held accountable, some of whom are still on the job to this day, preparing to not only continue collecting a paycheck and benefits, but also a pension for the abuse that they inflicted upon Minneapolis residents. So we ask you today, how is that acceptable? Minneapolis residents deserve better. What about all of the individuals who are still incarcerated, who have been wrongfully incarcerated at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department, falsifying evidence, lying in documents, lying in court, and still no real accountability? We have not seen a movement by Hennepin County judges to overturn those cases of those who have been wrongfully convicted. We have not seen a movement by those in authority to remove officers from the force who have a history of abuse against people. If you think Derek Chauvin was bad, look at the records of many of the officers who are a part of the Minneapolis Police Department. It wasn't just about one officer, it was about a system, and it's about a culture that has refused to change. So we stand here today in solidarity with the families who have lost loved ones to police violence, with people in the community who have been victimized and forced to suffer in silence as a result of what they endured, and those who do not trust the system because the system has let us down time and time and time again. So we call upon the Justice Department to not just work with the city of Minneapolis as it enters its negotiation, but to make good on what is said today, which is that they want the involvement of the community. So that means working in solidarity with us to continue to apply pressure to those in positions of power who have failed the residents of the city of Minneapolis. We also call upon the Minneapolis Foundation, which is an organization that I used to serve on the board of, that hired former Mayor R.T. Ryback to be its president. Under his leadership and the leadership of Chief Tim Dolan, we witnessed the continued erosion of the Minneapolis Police Department. We witnessed corruption, we witnessed abuse, we witnessed police murders, and instead of the foundation, a community foundation, holding this man accountable, they decided to hire him as their chief executive. As a philanthropic executive myself, I take issue with that. We need to hold leaders responsible, no matter how long ago they were in office, if they are a part of this mess that we are dealing with today. So we ask people around the country to continue to stand in solidarity with the residents of Minneapolis. Indeed, your voices made a difference when you took to the streets in the millions to call for justice for George Floyd and for other victims of police violence. Our work does not end here. We have to continue to be vigilant. We have to continue to hold elected officials accountable. And if we have to continue to take to the streets, then that is what we must do. What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now.
All right, you're listening to NPR News. You just, we popped in on a press conference from a group called Communities United Against Police Brutality. That was a longtime police reform advocate, Nakima Levy-Armstrong, going into some of the history of Minneapolis, and want to bring back in law professor Angie Porter. Angie, I think to your point you made earlier, a lot of residents in Minneapolis seem to feel like, you know, of course, all of this that's outlined in this 90-page report from the Department of Justice, of course this is going on and has been for decades. through the Minneapolis Police Department. What did you feel as you were listening to Nikema Levy-Armstrong's words?
I felt that. I felt what you just outlined. I think for Black people, for our Native American brothers and sisters, I think for journalists who've been covering this for years, it's all familiar. And there is understandably a feeling of resentment that it takes so much time, so many resources, so many people from the United States government structure to simply validate what's already known. But I will also say that the report, now that it's here, is a useful tool, and we can sort of step into this new reality by referencing it. In my opinion, this report should be required reading for all Minnesotans and beyond.
And folks can read it at nprnews.org. I would encourage people to go to nprnews.org and read it because it's very long. It does provide some details, case studies, very concerning matters, and then recommendations for change. And one of the things I think people will be curious about is how community members are wrapped into this process of the consent decree. And that's what Nikema Levy-Armstrong seemed to be saying was, please bring us to the table as residents of Minneapolis or community members. Can you explain how the consent
decree... Be part of MPD. He literally said, be one of us. After they were just read for filth by Kristen Clark, saying they bent children over on a car after stealing a $5 burrito, and had guns pulled out after 3 seconds getting out of their car, shooting at a car full of 6 people, telling Somali people that they didn't get the job done after Black Hawk Down. And the issue is the collective silence of white communities in Minnesota that have failed to talk about this. This is why it keeps happening. Why does it take the DOJ pulling up with a consent decree for people to say something? Why? Why am I standing in a press room full of white journalists and it's just me and a handful of other Black people there to watch and talk about it? Why is that? And you don't need to answer that right now. You need to talk about that after this press conference. You need to drill that question home. Because when they use that as a promo for the MPD, look no further than propaganda at the end of the DOJ's press conference. Come be one of us. Come be one of us. Do the killing with us. No. We need change. We need to address what they were talking about disproportionately pulling over people of color, mainly Black people and Indigenous people. Kristen Clark said it was a first that they've seen this much brutality after pulling over Black and Indigenous people. They addressed people with disabilities. They did not address houseless encampments that they brutalize all the time. And they did address people suffering from mental health crises. And they said they had a small pilot group that went around and they addressed mental health crises, but it wasn't enough because there's still MPD pulling up. The DOJ said it plain and simple that police are not able to deal with people that have some type of mental crisis. They said it right there. They said it right there in front of you.
For generations, there's 2 Minnesotas, and this lays it out. If you are someone who needs statistics, this is for you. And I would...
Mayor said, walking throughout his palatial brownstone, saying everything has to change. Yes, many things have to change. And it is very sad that we have leadership here that it just dawned upon them on May 25th, 2020. Because there are plenty of Black people up here and Indigenous people here that have known things have had to change their whole life. Right? We don't need to see a public lynching to know that things have to change. And I hope that the leadership here can do something about it. And my further hope is, like the hard work that all these people do up here, keep the conversation going in your white community, regardless of the discomfort. Brian Stevenson, the head of the Equity Justice Initiative, talks about the litany of brutality brought upon bodies of color. And he says one thing he'll never get over is the collective silence of white communities to turn the other way. Stop turning the other way.
White silence is violence.
The problem exists where they are.
Next we'll hear from Aaron Abraham with Minnesota Justice Coalition. I want to mention something about the section on behavioral health issues. This is an area that I head a work group for, and that we do an extensive amount of work. In fact, our work group wrote what is now Travis's Law, which requires 911 call centers to dispatch mental health crisis responders to most mental health crisis calls. We have been saying for forever that the city of Minneapolis is negligent in application of Travis's law, that they do not have, they have a pilot program that's been going on for close to 3 years, a pilot program that does not have nearly enough people to respond 24/7, 365 as the state statute requires, and that most mental health crisis calls in the city continue to be responded to by police. That is unacceptable. This is what we have seen. Our organization wrote a white paper in 2020 called Ending Police-Only Responses to Mental Health Crisis Calls. It is a robust paper that is being used all over the country to implement these programs, and it is outlandish to us that in our own city, we cannot get the city to follow the law and have appropriate responders to mental health crisis calls. 99.1% of mental health crisis calls do not involve a weapon or a threat. There is no excuse that most of these calls are still responded to by police. There is no excuse for this. The city likes to talk about how shorthanded they are. We don't have enough police and all that. Yet you're sending police out to calls that they do not need to go to and for which harm is definitely happening. We are demanding now that you stop sending police to mental health crisis calls. Now! That you build up the number of people you need to send a behavioral response instead. And this has been going on entirely too long. We are demanding. Don't wait for a consent decree. Don't wait for it. Stop harming people experiencing mental health crisis now by sending the appropriate responders. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Aaron Abraham, who is with the Minnesota Justice Coalition. Thank you.
Greetings. My name is Aaron Abram, A-B-R-A-M. I'm here on behalf of the Minnesota Justice Coalition. I'm a native Northsider, born and raised, whether 35th and Oliver or 10th and Emerson. And I can tell you, when I was accosted by the police when I was younger, I was told I was a liar. When I was placed in a position where I said, this is not true, and the court said differently, I was called a liar. Today, you are finally seeing, hearing, and understanding what we have been saying the entire time. What Michael Brown was saying the entire time. What Q was saying the entire time. And so now, what are you gonna do about it? Okay? Now I'm here to speak on behalf of the president of the Minnesota Justice Coalition, Mr. Jonathan McClellan, M-C-C-L-E-L-L-A-N. When the Minnesota Justice Coalition drafted the letter that we all signed asking for the Patterns and Practices investigation, we were in a place that desperately needed help. Let's not forget why we are here. Over the past 3 years, the Twin City communities have attempted to process and grieve the murders of George Floyd, of Daunte Wright, of Winston Smith, and several others. The lack of transparency and accountability from law enforcement has intensified and divided the community. Since then, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights released a scathing report that outlined their 2-year investigation into whether the Minneapolis Police Department and the city engaged in a pattern of racial discrimination. Sadly, this report confirms what protesters, community leaders, activists, and just regular old citizens like myself have been saying the entire time. It is not a level playing field for black and brown folks here, unfortunately. Our community members are hunted, surveilled on social media without a public safety objective, have to deal with propaganda that are racially profiled and brutalized. Furthermore, these officers are never held accountable by leadership or their own management. The U.S. Department of Justice found out something similar. Today, the Justice Department reported that the Minneapolis police engaged in a pattern of violating constitutional rights and discriminating against Black and Native American people, and concluded that systematic problems in the Minneapolis Police Department made what happened to George Floyd possible. Today's report found that Minneapolis police officers used excessive force, including unjustified deadly force. Violated the rights of people engaged in constitutionally protected speech. I was one of those people at Black Xmas, if you remember that, at the Mall of America. I was slammed in the parking lot. As they told me to leave, I did what they told me to do, and I still was arrested. I still was charged. I still had to plead for saying Black Lives Matter. I didn't hurt nobody. Read the reports. There was no damage to the Mall of America. We were held for hours under the mall. Women that needed heart medication had police officers stand in front of them and pour water in their face when they said I needed my medication. That's where we have been when we say we out here, when we say we're doing the work. They violated the rights of people engaged in constitutionally protected speech and found that both Minneapolis police and the city of Minneapolis discriminated against people with behavioral health disabilities when officers are called for help. The report outlined 28 remedial measures agreed to by the city and a consent decree to be overseen by an independent monitor. Our main question is in the negotiations for the change. In the enforcement of the consent decree, and we need to make sure that the individuals that are chosen to monitor the consent decree are chosen by the people, and that the process encompasses all community members' input in moving forward. It is extremely important that the integrity of the process is kept in place and voices are heard. Imperative. While Minneapolis has been a good place to start for the patterns and practice investigations, there's also evidence that suggests that the per capita rate of death at the hands of the police in St. Paul is equal to or greater than that of Minneapolis. In April of 2021, the Lieutenant Governor for the state of Minnesota said that Minnesota is a place where it is not safe to be Black. We are requesting that a patterns and practice investigation be opened on the St. Paul Police Department as well, due to the relationship that they have had with the city of Minneapolis and the potential for cross-contamination. We are also asking the county attorney's office to reinvestigate cases that were passed over by the previous county attorneys, starting with the murder of General Garland. It is important that an independent investigation shed light on the patterns of misconduct that exist in these agencies. We need reform. And ultimately justice for the victims. And establish trust in our institutions that are supposed to be protecting us. Isn't that what we pay for? Ain't that where your tax dollars go? Your tax dollars shouldn't just be used to pay somebody who abused somebody. It should be used to help protect the property that you have, the people you live with, and the family and community that you love. But instead, we're paying out. We still need your help to bring the change and adherence to the Constitution by our government. We know there is no silver bullet to solve the problems before us. However, we need a systemic reset that prioritizes our collective humanity. It was said a long time ago, and I'll say it again. It is always the right time to do the right thing. And this report shows they haven't been doing the right thing. So my question for everyone else is, what are you going to do in signifying the right thing to get the right result? Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I want to point out something that Aaron talked about, which is the issue of St. Paul. Our organization has endorsed a letter asking the Department of Justice to investigate St. Paul for two reasons. One is that